So when you're playing a game of Warhammer, and the rules that the opponent is saying that they have maybe sound a bit off, what's the best way to proceed? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought it would be fun to take a video to talk about misplays and working through rules errors in Warhammer 40k, and a few of the options to help deal with a game that's very complicated, and in a lot of games there's likely to be at least some subtle mistakes made on both sides. I feel like this is perhaps a uniquely Warhammer problem compared with some other games out there. Warhammer 40k is just a game with an enormous amount of content, 26 different factions, all with a massive amount of units with their own unique special rules and stratagems and supporting things, and arguably there's becoming more and more rules content as the codexes come out and each faction gets a bunch of different detachments to run around with. Even the absolutely most informed people in the game who play all the time aren't going to know every single rule, interaction or stat for every army out there. It's just not possible. So when you're playing any game of Warhammer 40k, whether it's casual or competitive, there is a bit of a reliance for your opponents to tell you how their army works accurately, as well as trying not to make any mistakes in general that might harm them. It's also their duty not to make any misplays in their favour, as it is kind of bad, and unless the person's playing them happens to have really good knowledge of the faction that they're going up against, they might be unlikely to be able to correct or spot any things that their opponents got wrong. With misplays in Warhammer, I would argue that deliberate hard cheating with just making stuff up and exaggerating things to your advantage is generally pretty rare. Being absolutely blatant with that just isn't really that possible for most people, given that when you eject rules, they can very easily be disproved. What I'd say tends to be more likely on tables, though, is people getting rules wrong that perhaps subtly exaggerate or ignore the downsides of certain units and abilities. I think when taking players in general, you're probably more likely to have people make misplays in their favour rather than against them, as I think it is kind of human nature to absolutely want the best for your little guys on the tabletop. So while you're trying to play a game with your opponent, you're probably trying to think of all the ways that you can get advantages, maybe more so than you're trying to think about your army's weaknesses and why you can't do certain things. On the other hand, though, perhaps more unpleasantly, this sort of thing might also represent someone trying to push their luck a little bit and maybe see what they can get away with plausible deniability if they are called out on it. In general, though, I'd certainly not be aiming to attribute things to malice, where just simple mistakes and misunderstandings are absolutely a reasonable explanation. The rules and the mental load of Warhammer 40k are just absolutely enormous. Even the best players around make serious errors with their army from time to time. And when you do make errors, you're perhaps just as likely to forget a key rule that benefits you, or some other minor rule that happens to be to your detriment rather to favour you. In any case, for whatever motivation, these misplays do tend to happen in games of 40k, and I would argue that being able to be a little bit assertive on the tabletop, flag errors that you notice when they come up, and have a good way to resolve them is actually kind of important with winning games. If you're passive to the extent where you just never even challenge blatant misplays, you'd likely lose at least some games that you might have won otherwise, for not plucking up a bit of effort to make a pushback on something that really doesn't sound like it's being played right. For this video, I thought it would be good to talk through a few ways in which players might handle these situations. First up, and by far the most obvious, is asking to check the rules, which I think is something that most people out there are fairly comfortable doing, though I guess it might be a little bit less so for newer players out there. 40k is not exactly supposed to be a game where any information is kept hidden from either player, so if you did see a rule that's just plain unlikely with the way it's being interpreted or seems to give some pretty excessive power, I feel like most opponents would find it pretty reasonable if you just say, yes, can I have a look at that rule myself as well? It just seems very strong and I'd like to see how it works exactly. Or if you'd seen the rule plays in a different way before, you could say, I thought that it worked like this, are we okay to just double check it? That way it's no big deal if you happen to be either right or wrong, so it's hardly the most unreasonable question in the world. In 10th edition it shouldn't really be all that hard to be able to access players' rules. I generally consider it a bit of a minimum if you're meeting up for a game to have your faction's rules on you. The codex for the armies that have one, but I guess anyone can reference Games Workshop's PDFs by downloading them, or check Games Workshop's app for the armies that are still in their index states. At least compared with 9th edition, I feel like the rules are quite a lot easier than they used to be to reference. All stratagems, detachment rules, and army rules fit on one page if you're playing with a codex, or just a few pages of PDF via an index, and things are generally quite a lot more searchable than they used to be. Again, you could use Games Workshop's app to find certain bits of war gear or certain data cards, or use the find function within one of their PDFs potentially. I think if phrased in a polite way, then this is almost never a bad thing. They probably want to be saving it for areas where you actually think that there is a danger of the person having actually misplayed. It's not really going to work as a game of Warhammer if you're challenging literally everything all the time. And I think the framing of it's kind of important. It's a lot more feels bad if you're framing it as a sort of accusation of them cheating or misplaying or something, as opposed to just double checking a rule and presuming that they're right until proven otherwise. Otherwise, just for speed and simplicity, rather than wading through codex books or the core rules, or worse, the designer's commentary, you might be able to ask a third party for advice. If you're playing in a gaming club and there's plenty of people playing 40k, there's a pretty reasonable chance that other people on other tables might well know the rules interaction that you're talking about, unless it's something really specific and unique to one given army. I guess potentially things could be quite a bit more variable depending on how hard the question is and the other people's knowledge. I guess you might just get someone else's reckon as opposed to something that's more definitive. But if you do manage to find someone who does actually know the rule in question quite well and can be pretty certain about it, that could perhaps be one of the very fastest ways to resolve an issue. At tournaments and events even, that still might be all that really matters, just to ask the next player on the next table. So if there happens to be a tournament organiser nearby and free, you might be able to just run something past them very quickly if it's something that they know well. And again, that might be faster than checking for technical rules interactions if they do know it. If it is something that it's going to be easier to work out just by referencing the rules though, that's probably better to go down that sort of route first. Make sure you get the rule out, have a good read of it, and that might well just clear up any issues, particularly if they're busy with issues on other tables. They've probably got quite a lot of people who might be coming to them for rules queries. I feel like in discussion around tournaments, a lot of feels bad might come after the fact if you feel like one player's not played you fair. And say with commentary on things like Reddit or other places, the feedback often is it's like, yes, in hindsight, you probably should have got a tournament organiser involved earlier when the first red flag started to show, as opposed to holding off as long as possible or even just not bothering for the entire game and then only realising your mistake later. I guess this feels like it's a bit more official, like you're sort of calling a ref over, and I guess might have the potential to put the other players back up a little bit more. But in general, if they're confident about their ruling, it shouldn't really be the most stressful thing in the world. And again, at the end of the day, it's not usually like you're accusing anyone of anything more than an honest misplay, as opposed to some sort of deliberate hard cheating. At the same time though, I do think that there's a bit of a balance, where as I said, you can't really afford to literally check every single rule and interaction that your opponent's trying to say that they have. That's not really going to work in any sort of reasonable time for a Warhammer game, with quite so many rules and special rules and things are likely to come up. For this one, I couldn't really help but think back to one tournament that I went to in the distant past, and I was playing against someone who was kind of clearly quite new to the game, but also super paranoid about every rules interaction that they thought had worked differently, and basically wound up just calling it the tournament organiser over multiple times in the game for really quite simple rules interactions that were part of the core rules, and it was just kind of surprising that they were trying to debate them really. Again, I suppose that's probably being a bit new and not really quite knowing how things work that contributed to that though. I did find it just a little bit annoying when we kept on having to wait and explain things for a few minutes in between interactions, but to be fair to him, I think it was mainly just because he was a bit newer, didn't really understand a few of the ways that some quite major things worked in the game yet, and he was perfectly pleasant about it each time, even if it was perhaps a bit too often for my taste. I feel like it is perhaps a bit of a tricky balance to strike though, as particularly if you've got limited knowledge about the opponent's armies and stratagems and unit abilities and things, you can't really afford to be challenging everything. They're going to be having all sorts of crazy and fun and powerful rules, and in reality it might mean that you don't really have much scope for spotting things that are being subtly misplayed if the opponent's getting a rule wrong in their favour somehow, and you're likely to only really start to understand that after you've played the army a few times, maybe with different opponents, or just played a lot of Warhammer 40k and you know what's kind of likely to happen in rules and what's very unlikely or abnormal. Games Workshop do tends to repeat the same kind of rules a few times across multiple different armies in different forms. Otherwise, if you think something is probably the way that the opponent said it was, but you still like to know the technicalities and see if there's anything else about the rule that you should be aware of, you could potentially have a short crafted rules check yourself. And I feel like in 10th edition this one's a bit more doable than most other editions beforehand, particularly with most of the armies still being in index form on the Warhammer 40k app. If it's something that's going to be really quite easy to reference just by searching the unit's name, taking a look at the exact text of their special rule or reading through a stratagem, then it could be an easy way to just quickly check that nothing's being misplayed while not really slowing down the game at all. During your opponent's turn, it's going to be them that's active most of the time, besides a few things like some reactive stratagems and rolling some saves, so you might have a little bit of time where you can do a quick bit of research as they go about their actions. Warpedia could potentially be another good source for referencing datasheets for that as well. particularly as it can just be directly Googled for armies that already have their codex out and might no longer have their digital rules available. Most of the time you can just satisfy yourself that the rule worked as it was said, and for the times that you didn't, just say that you've quickly had a double check of that and it might have been played wrong, and then look at the ways that you might be able to fix the mistake. Talking of which, if something is kind of pivotal, it's probably best to check the rules at the time, rather than just hand-waving it if you are genuinely unsure, as often if you check things right then and there, you will be able to actually rectify any mistake and put the game back on course. It's just not really much good if you manage to spot a mistake that went back several battle rounds, say a pivotal unit that would have just died might have just lived, and then that might have had massive consequences for the rest of the game if they destroyed something important or you needed to move something else to deal with them. Or loads of thoughts and decisions that might have gone on after that. It might be just genuinely impossible to unpick the game as if the mistake hadn't happened. Sometimes though, I still would argue that it might not actually be worth getting an 100% accurate answer and getting right to the bottom of things, particularly if you're playing a bit more casually, or the potential rules error isn't all that pivotal. If your opponent's certain that it's one way that things work, you could just go with their interpretation and make sure that you look it up after the game so you know what you're doing when the situation next comes around. And if it's genuinely unclear when both players think that the rule works in a different way and you can't find any obvious answer either in the core rules and you might not be bothered to wade through the designer's commentary document or anything like that, you could just literally do a dice roll off for it. Say on a 4+ it goes your way, on a 1-3 it works my way. That could be a way of making things kind of amicable for both players if there's a disagreement that you can't fix then and there. I think in quite a few settings it just might not be all that worth it to get a right answer, and it gets back to the actual gameplay a bit quicker. As mentioned earlier, I certainly wouldn't attribute anything that could just be simple mistakes down to malice or anything like that, but personally things that would make me a bit more suspicious is particularly when the opponent has made multiple serious misplays in their favour and haven't really been getting anything wrong the other way round. If say you're going through a game of 40k and you've caught 4 or 5 major errors that they've done in their favour, and you've had to check and correct their rules that many times, then that would probably be getting to the sort of point where I'd be questioning their intentions a bit. It's just getting increasingly unlikely that these are all just good faith errors, particularly if they're all going one way. I feel like usually you can get a fairly good sense of players' general attitude as well, whether errors are just down to them being new or a bit careless, or they seem to be super hot on just about every other rule in the game but are making mistakes for their own army's rules. The latter would definitely raise my suspicions a bit more than others that they're trying to push their luck and not playing politely. Otherwise though, if they're making errors both for and against them, or the points they've come up could be easily mistaken, or aren't particularly serious, I probably wouldn't take it too to heart. And at the same time, I'd also self-reflect on any mistakes that you might have made that might have been construed in the same way. Absolutely everyone makes mistakes, myself included. It is kind of expected with the sheer breadth of rules in 40k. In any case, hope you've enjoyed a few thoughts on that. What's your preferred way to try and handle rules mistakes that the other player might make? And I'd particularly like to hear any examples where you've done things and it's worked either well or poorly. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Otherwise, if you'd like to help keep these videos coming, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.